So strategic alternatives are those courses of action which the organization can pursue at one point of time. So in organizations of medium to large size, the following mechanisms may be adopted for identifying the strategic alternatives. From the viewpoint of an organization, strategic alternatives can be classified on the basis of risk involved. Hello everyone, I am Purnima, faculty in the Department of Commerce and Management, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. I welcome you all to this session. In this session, we will be having a discussion on what are strategic alternatives. So in the previous session, we had a discussion on what are the steps in strategic planning, and now we will have a look at what are the strategic alternatives. So strategic alternatives refer to different courses of action which as organization may pursue at a point. So strategic alternatives are those courses of action which the organization can pursue at one point of time. So these alternatives are crucial to the success of an organization. They are influenced by external factors over which the organization has limited control. So these factors are those which are crucial to the success of the organization. So these are those courses of action over which the organization has no control, and those external factors, they constitute the strategic alternatives. So strategic alternatives are those things over which the organization has limited control. Next, every organization has to identify alternate courses of action for its survival and growth. The procedure may differ from one organization to other organization depending upon its size. So, the strategic alternatives, let us see. So, every organization has to identify the alternative courses of action for its survival and growth. So, the procedure may differ from one organization to other organization depending upon its size. Then, all decisions made by the owner himself or by the chief executive. So what is the alternative decision to be taken? So it will be taken by the owner of the business or the CMO of the business. Then next, let us see how we generate the strategic alternatives. So in organizations of medium to large size, the following mechanisms may be adopted for identifying the strategic alternatives. So there are various ways in which we can have the strategic alternatives. In this, the first one is the brainstorming session. Now, what is this brainstorming session? So we have a committee of members who will be there, and they will be engaged in coming up with new ideas. So however silly the idea may be, they just come there and they just write down all the ideas and they evaluate each of those ideas. So in most organizations, strategic alternatives are identified during the brainstorming sessions. They are encouraged to come out with any course of action which they feel is possible. So each of the participants in the brainstorming session, they come up with new ideas. They don't mind even if it's a very silly idea, but then they come up with new ideas so which they feel it is possible. Then at this stage, no importance is attached to the relative demerits and demerits of the alternatives. So what are the merits and demerits of the alternative? All those will be considered and then will not be considered when the ideas are emerging. Later on, they will come to that. So each alternative is reviewed and analyzed, and the final selection of one or more alternatives. So they will have a final selection of one or more alternatives, and before they have the selection, they conduct a review of all the ideas. The chief executive selects the most appropriate alternative based on the current resources, acting as a criteria for selecting the alternative. So when the chief CEO of the company, so when he is making a choice of the alternatives, he will be focusing on the current resources, whatever is available. So based on which he will be deciding about the alternative for the company. Then Next one is special meetings. Now, what are these special meetings? So, large organizations hold special meetings for generating strategic alternatives. The participants present alternative scenarios along with the recommended courses of action. So, depending about the values, future trends, alternative courses of action are often recommended. An attempt is made through the discussions to arrive at a consensus. So, next is the special meetings. Now, what are these special meetings? So, they hold special meetings to generate alternatives. So, the participants present alternative scenarios along with the recommended courses of action. So, what is the scenario and what is the course of action? So, based on which this will be based on the future trends, then alternative courses of action are often recommended. Then later on, an attempt is made through the discussion to arrive at a consensus. So, in the meeting, after a consensus is reached, only then they will be having a selection of the alternative. Then, third one is outside consultant. So, this procedure is based on the premise that an outsider can observe the alternatives in a objective manner. So, this strategic alternatives also can be arrived by hiring an outside observer. So, because he will not know anything about the company, so he will be just an observer and he will be in a better position to assess the company. The executives who have been actively associated with a particular project are often so involved with it that they tend to be subjective and overlook its shortcoming. Now, the outside consultants, they will be hired to observe the company's actual position of the company, because already those who are involved in the company, they will be working in a subjective manner and they will be overlooking its shortcoming, and as such an outside observer will be in a better position to assess the company's position. Next is, under such conditions, engaging an outside consultant may be more effective way to generate strategic alternatives on an objective basis. The outside viewpoint is expected to be new and fresh and can show up many new opportunities toward the organization. So, an outside consultant, he will be a best judge of the organization, and with his help, we can get a new and fresh show, and he can also be able to identify the opportunities which are there in front of the organization. Then, fourth one is joint meetings. So, another way of generating alternatives is the services of a consultant, but to some extent the internal members in the process. The main aim of this method is able to combine the advantages of new ideas contributed by the outside members blended with the workable solutions rendered by inside members within the organization. So, in a joint meeting, you have the outside consultants and also the inside members of the organization, and both of them together, they will hold this joint meetings. So, in this way, the outside member will be looking after the opportunities before the company, whereas the inside members, they will be coming up by the workable situations within the organization. So, in this way, they can come up with various strategic alternatives. Then, from the viewpoint of an organization, strategic alternatives can be classified on the basis of risk involved. So, they are, the first one is the niche strategy. Now, what is this niche strategy? Niche means concentrating around a product and market. So, it is a strategy involving a very low degree of risk and represents the typical behavior of the small companies. So, niche strategy means it is a strategy which revolves around a product or a market, and it is a strategy involving very low degree of risk. There is no risk at all, and it represents the typical behavior of the small companies. So, such organizations are scared of growing big as it would entail them into legal, labor and management problems. So, these niche strategy companies, they are very small companies and they are scared of growing very big because it will engage them in legal, labor and management problems. Then, the next one is vertical integration. This can assume two forms, that is the backward and forward. So, the backward integration means to acquire suppliers labeled for critical inputs for the business. So in the case of forward integration, the companies try to reach customers through their own distributional network. Organization follows forward integration to take advantages of closer contact with the customers. So in a vertical integration, we have two types, that is the forward and the backward. So in the backward integration, we have a tie-up with the suppliers to see that we get the raw materials for the company directly, whereas in case of a forward integration, we tie up with the suppliers or the ultimate retailers. So the company will be directly engaging in sales with the ultimate consumers through its distributional network. So through this kind of an integration, the company can take advantage of the closer contact with the customers. Horizontal expansion. Horizontal expansion results when a firm adds new products or enters into new markets. Most pharmaceutical companies follow this strategy. The company will be adding more and more products to the product line, and as such, it will try to enter new products with this, new markets with this new products. For example, the pharmaceutical company. And the last one is diversification. In diversification, an enterprise has new products or businesses which may be related or unrelated to the existing business. So this is very, very important. So the company may go into an entirely new sector over which it has no experience before. So that it involves high degree of risk as it amounts to manufacturing new product or entering into new products, new markets unfamiliar to the organization. So in case of this diversification, we should understand that the company is testing the waters. Now, what is this testing the waters? So it is not familiar with that kind of a sector, but then it will enter those sectors where it has not entered before. So that we call it as diversification. Then lastly, we have the selection of a strategy. Now, once the analysis of current and projected performance of the company based on existing strategies and assessment of desired performance is done, the strategic gap is identified, and then the process of narrowing down a number of possible strategic alternatives starts with the consideration of the strategic gap. So, we need to know what are the gaps in the strategies. So, once we are done with the plans, then we have an assessment of the desired performance is done, then the strategic gap is identified. So, there may be a few unanswered questions in the plan, so which has to be addressed. So, in the process of narrowing down a number of possible strategic alternatives. So, when we are having so many alternatives before us, we narrow down on one particular alternative. So, based on the consideration with the strategic gap we have in the plans. Then, next, the strategic gap is pursued as the difference between the targeted performance and the projected performance following the present strategies. Now, how do you identify the gaps in the strategic planning? So, it is the difference between the targeted performance and the projected performance. So, what is the targeted performance and what is the projected performance? And based on that, we can have the what is the present strategy? So, we have to identify the gaps in the planning process. The gap can be very narrow or very large, very big, or the perceived gap is narrow. One would expect that the present strategy would be followed. So, if the gap is very narrow, then no problem. Whatever is the present strategy, it can be followed. But then if there is a very wide gap, then we have to think about the alternatives. So, a larger gap can be caused by increase in targeted level of performance or the adverse changes in the environment which would lead to poor performance in future from the present strategies. Now, suppose if we identify a very large gap in the planning process, then it means that it could be caused by the increasing in the targeted level of performance. So, if you have set a very high level of target for performance, or there are adverse changes in the environment. So, their environment is not cooperating with the targets, then we need to see that the present strategy is not favorable for the company. A large positive gap is likely to occur due to environmental opportunities and large negative gap due to environmental threats. So whatever the environmental opportunities and threats are there, so it has to be identified and set right before we have the strategic plan implementations. Then in small and medium sized organization, one of the many strategies must be followed. So in large complex multi-product organization, a combination of strategies is most likely. Suppose we have a small organization, we can have only one of the strategies to be followed. But if it is a very huge organization with multiple products, then we need to have a combination of strategies. So in India, large domestic private sector companies tend to prefer growth strategies. So almost all the private sector companies, they prefer the growth strategies. Then next one is strategic implementation. Strategic management can be implemented when the action required with new visions and missions and also with new and existing opportunities. So what is the new vision and mission of the organization and what are the opportunities before the organization? So based on that, the implementation can be done. So it is the process of translation of strategies and policies into the action through the development of programs, budgets and procedures. So programs, budgets and procedures, they help in a very good implementation of the strategic plans. Then it is typically conducted by the middle and low level management, but it is reviewed by the top management. However, programs and procedures are simply more detailed plans for the implement of a strategy. So we need to have programs, procedures and budgets at every stage of the plan so that it can be effectively implemented. With this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you.